have no housing protection. So people who are transgender can be evicted from their apartments solely for being transgender, again, with no recourse. Doctors can refuse care to us, even emergency care, because of lawsuits filed by our Attorney General, Ken Paxton. So life became very, very different for me. And so that's what got me into advocacy, because it's like quite an awakening when you lose half your civil rights just for waking up one day and living your truth. So I'm more than happy to discuss those aspects of it or any others as we go along. Click on that one, this one, and I think we're off to the races. Awesome. So I can certainly do as long as you want to go, but rather than have a lecture, I'd rather have a discussion. And so if you've encountered situations where pronoun usage has been problematic or unsure, I'm more than happy to talk about that with you. If you don't want to ask verbally, you can put it in the chat, but it's not like we have a giant room full of several hundred people. It's fine with me if you want to unmute and ask as we go along through here, because you're not going to derail me or anything like that. And there's also no question that you can ask that to me is really out of bounds. I always say, if you're going to offend me, you have to bring your A game. So if there's questions that you wanted to know, just ask away and we'd be more than happy to talk about it.
Leslie, can I just add one thing?
Sure.
If you have a question, but you don't want to ask your question, you'd rather ask your question anonymously, please send me your question and let me know that you want it to be anonymous, and I will read it out anonymously.
Perfect. That's wonderful. Also, too, what I'm going to do is bounce into the chat and I'll put in my phone number, my cell number. Because I can't tell you the number of times that people have had questions or something will pop up later on down the road and they'll go, oh, I wish I would have asked that. Call me. You're not going to bother me. I'm more than happy to answer the phone. That's what I do. It's my job. So I'm more than happy to chat. So yeah, my name is Leslie. I'm the Transgender Education and Advocacy Associate for Resource Center. And if you're not familiar with Resource Center, I'll give you a little bit about it. That last one was me. It was at the state capitol. With Patrick, who's another member of our advocacy team. My email address is there. It's L McMurray. I know sometimes it looks like an I, but it's a lowercase L. So it's lmcmurray@myresourcecenter.org. I answer every single email that I get. So this is our main community center. Although we have 5 different locations, we have a testing clinic that's in Cedar Springs called the Nelson Thibodeau Clinic. And we do free HIV and STD testing at that clinic. And then we also have a new mobile van, the Sexy Health mobile van, which goes around to various counties and outlying areas, because not everybody is in Cedar Springs or wants to come in there for testing. So we take testing to them. We also run a food pantry and a hot meals program for people living with HIV and AIDS. That's done through the Ryan White grant. We also have case management and insurance assistance, where we pay for people's health insurance that are living with HIV and AIDS. We also have a primary care clinic, a behavioral health program, and for school-age kids, middle school to high school, we run a program called Youth First. And so if there are kids within your schools that identify as LGBT, we have a drop-in center that's open from about 4 to 9 every day. This was pre-COVID. We've had to do things virtually since then, but even during the summers, we do field trips to museums and all kinds of fun things. We serve around 500 youth, and we certainly have more bandwidth for them. So I can give you numbers if you want to reach out to the people that run Youth First, because that's a wonderful resource. And oftentimes it's a safe space for kids. So at the end of this is really a light touch, and it's kind of dipping the toe into the water of the LGBT world, because we have things that are more focused on like LGBTQ 101 or 102. We also have a transgender training, but we're just going to talk about terminology associated with the LGBTQ community. And we'll also go over pronouns and why they're important, as well as some do's and don'ts and what to do if you make a mistake. So again, as we move along, if you have questions, please ask. LGBTQ, our agency just over the last week or two kind of changed that, because like maybe 15 years ago, if you saw it, it would be GLBT. And then it got changed a while back to LGBT. And that was sort of a tribute to the many lesbians that cared for guys back in the 80s that were dying of AIDS, and they jumped in and took care of people that no one else would. And so I think that tribute put the L in front. And then we added a Q some time back, and that's talking about people that are queer or questioning. Queer is kind of an umbrella term for the LGBTQ community, but it also can be problematic. It has some history associated with it. So I would be careful in using the Q, and we'll talk about it as we go on. But we've since just a week or so ago changed to LGBTQIA+. And so we'll go over those identities in just a little bit. And those aren't all of them. So in the LGBTQ, the first three letters deal with sexual orientation. And essentially that's who you're attracted to. Everybody has a sexual orientation. Even if you're not attracted to anybody, that's an orientation. So those first three, L, G, and B, are sexual orientation. T deals with gender identity, and Q is kind of, like I said, that umbrella term for the community. So sexual orientation is someone's enduring physical, romantic, or emotional and spiritual attraction to another person. It might be same sex, could be opposite sex, could be all of the above, but everybody has a sexual orientation. Some of the flags you'll see are the kind of pride flags for various identities, because that's a thing in our community. Everybody gets a flag, and we have the kind of unifying rainbow flag as well. And even that's been amended over time to add black and brown stripes for our black and brown people. And then it's added a little kind of a triangle in there with the trans flag in there to it's called the inclusive pride flag. So someone who's bisexual is an individual who is physically, romantically, or emotionally attracted to two genders. If we were doing this a few years ago, we might say attracted to both men and women, but we know that gender is more of a spectrum, so we're kind of paying attention to that. For people that are bisexual, experience is not the determiner. It has to do with attraction. You could have, for instance, a woman who marries her high school sweetheart, who's a guy, but she's always been attracted to both men and women. But she gets married to a guy, has two kids, and they're married for 40 years, still bisexual. Has to do with attraction, not who you're with, has nothing to do with experience or any of those kind of things. So it just is, if you're attracted to both, you would identify as bisexual. So yeah, in fact, bisexual people need not have had any sexual experience at all in order to identify that way. For people who are asexual, I'm not particularly on board with that first definition, which is a person who does not experience sexual attraction. The really correct language is someone who experiences sexual attraction in a way that is below average. And I don't like the term normal either, because I don't even know what normal is. Living my life for a while, the word normal is kind of, but and also too, I think if you use the word normal, it says anyone outside that area would then be by definition abnormal. And so we don't want to be describing people as abnormal if they just identify in a way that is not average or not like the typical person you'll run across. So asexual is somebody who experiences sexual attraction in a lower sort of way. And there are different definitions for that. Ace is one of them. It's an umbrella term referring to individuals who identify in the asexual spectrum. Demisexual describes someone who would want to have a deep emotional kind of friendship with somebody before they would find them attractive. I am one of those people. I can appreciate the beauty of someone that I see, a really good looking guy or a gorgeous woman, but I wouldn't be attracted to them because I don't know them. It's sort of, you're a stranger. But if I got to know you and we were really close, then there would be this attraction that would build over time. So that's just me. Also, when we talk about things like gender identity and the term asexual, in our society, it's easier for us because things are busy and they're going so fast. It's easier for us to look at things in these two little buckets. It's either light or it's dark. It's hot or it's cold. It's on or it's off. It's boy or it's girl. But nature isn't that way. We know that because water can be in a solid state of ice. It could be a liquid state of water, and it could also be frozen, so it's a solid, or it could be gas because it's been boiled into steam. So, and it could be tepid and lukewarm and kind of hot to the touch and good for washing dishes and all these little points along the spectrum. And so that's where sexuality can be, or sexual attraction, or even gender identity. So we tend to look at those things more, instead of like an on-off switch, we look at them more like a dimmer switch. So this level of sexuality can be along this continuum anywhere. And that's just more how some folks identify. We're also, these terms are for the kind of the broad umbrella. The abbreviation is SGM, and that's sexual and gender minorities, because there just aren't very many of us, but we're out there. So when we're talking about asexual people, that tends to be a minority of a minority, but again, they're there. Someone who's pansexual is someone who doesn't limit their attraction relative to sexual orientation or gender identity. They just say, I'm attracted to you, and it doesn't really matter whether you are gay or straight or whatever, they're just attracted to you. Gender identity, that's the gender with which someone identifies. And in the vast majority of people, that is with the sex assigned at birth. But I'm fond of saying that people, who identify with their sex assigned at birth are not normal, they're just common. But there is no real count because the United States Census does not count LGBT people in a meaningful way. And that's intentional, because the census determines where money goes. And if they exclude a particular group, there's no money allocated to support that group when they need it. So for the purposes of estimating populations, there is a think tank out of UCLA School of Law called the Williams Institute, and they make population estimates. And their estimates are that the LGBTQ community makes up between about 4.5% and 5% of the general population. Transgender people make up 0.52% of the population. And so that's not very many, but if you look at it as an aggregate, for the United States, it's about 1.35 million people. So there's still some of us out there, and I think it's important to know that we're there, but it's kind of, I think this is where a good example, during the last legislative session, there were efforts afoot to keep transgender girls from playing sports in school. There are over 826,000 high school athletes in the state of Texas. I don't know anyone that can name 5 of them that are transgender. It's just not a problem. They're not marauding around and winning, state records and trophies and all that sort of stuff. They just want to be socialized and associated with people like them. Because if you identify as a little girl and you're chucked in with the guys because of anatomy, it can be a pretty miserable existence. I know because I experienced that. When I was born, it was a long time ago. I'm pretty old. I was born before sonograms and cell phones and things like that. So when I was little, the word transgender wasn't coined until I was 14. So I didn't have a definition for how I felt and who I was. I certainly didn't have one of these that I could punch in and say, why do I feel like the way I do? And so I just did the best I could. I tried to, be a pleaser and do the things that my parents and society expected me to do, but never wanting or feeling comfortable doing those things. And so school can be particularly miserable for people that kind of paddle against the stream. So getting back to the identification of people that are transgender, if you don't identify as your sex assigned at birth, that umbrella term transgender is used. For people that are transgender, I don't fully understand why. And to me, it's really not important that I understand why I am the way I am, but it's never changed. I know that from my earliest recollection and where my name Leslie came from, I grew up in Southern California. My mom, she worked most of the time. So my parents were unusual in that both parents worked. But it was a weekend and she was ironing. And I asked her, I said, Mom, what was my girl name supposed to be? Because like I said, before sonograms, parents had to wait till the baby was born to find out if it's boy or girl, and they would typically pick both names. And she said, we were going to name you Leslie. And I said, I like that name. And I didn't know where else to take the conversation because there wasn't a National Geographic with a transgender kid's picture on the cover. And there was no TV shows like Orange is the New Black or movies or role models or anyone that I could look to say, I'm like them. And so I asked her, and to me, that name has always been precious to me. And so as soon as I could change my name legally, I did. So I talked about the little kind of the bucket theory there. The idea of two genders is called the gender binary. And there's also heteronormativity. You know, like people assume, like if they see me and they see that I'm wearing a wedding ring, they'll ask what my husband does. Because people just assume that you're married to a guy. And I'm not. I'm married to a woman. And so there's just those kind of assumptions when you meet someone. Oh, is your husband home? Or can I talk to your husband? It's like, no, not really. So we recognize two genders as well. And we refer to that as the gender binary. So gender non-binary or gender diverse is a term that people will adopt if they don't fall into one of those two binary categories of male or female. And it's important to understand that for people that are binary, it's not that they're like half man, half woman, or that they're, you know, sitting right in that median, although they might, but they probably sit somewhere along a point or a continuum where they feel comfortable. And like when I grew up, there was very rigid gender norms. You know, like guys were supposed to be tough and willing to fight and be disciplinarians and be, you know, good fathers and providers and all those kind of things. And women didn't really matter if you got much of an education because your job was to stay at home and raise the kids. And you're supposed to be pretty and adhere to beauty standards and do all these things. And for kids now, they are saying that both of those are not appealing to me, nor do they describe who I am or how I feel. And so more often, kids are saying, I'm going to identify somewhere in the middle or on, you know, off of one of those continuum points. And so they're essentially telling you who they are. And for non-binary people, it's a challenge because our society is set up for only two genders. It's like if you have a person of drinking age and you say, hey, let's go out and grab happy hour, but they are non-binary and they dress in a fairly androgynous way. If you go out to a neighborhood bar, you see two bathrooms, men and women. But for a non-binary friend, what they may see is stands a good chance of being assaulted or might call the police. And neither one of those is a really good option. And so they don't go or they don't drink or, you know, participate very much because the options available to them don't adhere to their identities. So it's really important. You don't have to understand necessarily for what it means for someone to be non-binary in order to respect them, but being respectful includes using the correct name and pronouns. And sometimes those pronouns are things like they or them. And as educators, you might look at they and them as plural pronouns, but they're not. They're conditionally plural. Because like if you have everybody clears out of the classroom, but there's a jacket sitting over one of the chairs, and you say, oh, someone left their jacket here. I wonder if they go back and get it, or if I should take it to them. So we're using those pronouns to describe one person, right? We're not talking about four people coming back and getting the jacket, just one. But we use it when we haven't identified the gender of the person who left the jacket. So maybe if you think about it in those terms, if someone says my pronouns are they, them, you can picture that jacket sitting over a chair as something, because we automatically use they, them as singular pronouns at certain times when appropriate. So that isn't something that's brand spanking new. They and them have been around in a singular fashion for a long, long time. And we use it that way. We just don't think about it. For those of us whose pronouns are an issue, we do think about it a lot. And I'll talk about that in a bit. Some of the others, again, these are like minorities of minorities, but genderqueer is a catch-all for gender identities that fall outside the binary. But not everybody uses genderqueer as an identification. And so if a student identified to you as genderqueer, I think it's okay if you were to refer to them that way. But I wouldn't greet someone for the first time and say, oh, you must be genderqueer, because not everyone does. And it's the same thing with non-binary people. Not every non-binary person considers themselves to be transgender. Many, many do, and it's kind of considered under the umbrella. But for those that don't, that's perfectly fine with me. They may not want to live under that tent, and that's okay. So a lot of these, and it can be frustrating, but they are self-identities. They're saying, this is how I feel, this is who I am, and that's okay. The term pangender, pan is that Greek Latin root meaning all. So it's someone that may experience all genders at different times. Gender fluid is kind of a different definition of that. Gender fluid implies someone who would express gender a little bit differently one day to the next. It's kind of, you know, might get up on the girl side of the bed one day or the boy side on the next. Someone who is agender is another group who is not transgender. People that are agender don't experience gender. And so for them, it's a non-issue. It's just, you know, but they also don't identify as being transgender. Gender identity disorder was a term that was used in the DSM up until the DSM-5 in 2013, when the DSM, which is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual that psychologists, psychiatrists use to identify mental illness, they got rid of the term disorder and replaced it with gender dysphoria. And that's the correct term now as a diagnosis, because being transgender is no longer considered by the psychological community as being a disorder. Sadly, in the codes that your doctor uses for insurance billing, are called the ICD-10 codes, the definition is still non-specific gender identity disorder, and they haven't been brought up to date yet, but hopefully they will at some point. I've put in an application to have them please do that, because like if you get a blood test from your doctor and you have to take that to a lab somewhere to get your blood drawn, and it has that ICD-10 code, it's spelled out right on the order, and it says non-specific gender identity disorder. So I have to go to a lab where they may not feel friendly towards transgender people, and I have to out myself as being transgender, and I have to tell them I have a mental disorder. So I'm suddenly now not very comfortable that I'm going to be treated the way that I need to be treated at that lab. So that's when I talk to my doctor and say, there's other ways you can use that, because you're not treating me for that. You're just asking me for a blood test. It's not a transgender blood test. It's just a blood test. So there's other codes that they can use, but doctors sometimes are either unaware of that, or they just get lazy, and everything to do with you is transgender. It's like, if I need stitches, I've got transgender stitches. It's like, no, I just need stitches. Gender expression is how we express gender to the outside world. Simple as that. So I'm dressed in a fairly stereotypically feminine way, so that's my gender expression. It's interesting to note, gender expression has been protected in employment since 1988. That was when a lawsuit was filed against Price Waterhouse, which is one of these big stodgy accounting firms. There was a woman whose last name was Hopkins. The lawsuit was Price Waterhouse v. Hopkins. She was an employee of Price Waterhouse who did not dress, act, or even speak in a stereotypically feminine way. And after some discussions with her, they ended up terminating her because of it. And she took them to court, and she ended up winning. The Supreme Court said that forcing somebody to adhere to a sex stereotype is a violation of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, which prohibits discrimination because of sex. And so if you're forcing someone to adhere to a sex stereotype, that is because of sex. And they have since added sexual orientation and gender identity back in June of 2020 with the Bostock versus Clayton County, Georgia ruling, which also said that sexual orientation, gender identity are protected because of sex. So there you go, a little Supreme Court trivia. Gender nonconforming, or GNC, might be anyone with a gender variance or gender nonconformity or gender diverse. Often with young kids, we refer to it as being gender creative. And I think sometimes parents will freak out if their kid kind of tries on something that's maybe outside the gender norms. And the recommendation that I always give is for them not to panic, because the diagnosis of a transgender kid is someone who is insistent, consistent, and persistent. And not many end up being that way. They might try it on for a while. It could be something they're doing for friends or whatever it might be. But if they are insistent, consistent, persistent, every day, relentless over time, that's when you have someone who is transgender. And again, they make up 0.52% of the population. So, I think parents get overly concerned. And quite frankly, even if their kid is transgender, there's nothing to fix. It's just a matter of understanding, loving them anyway, and being affirming. And that's the very best tonic that you can give to a transgender or gender nonconforming kid, is to just wrap them up in your arms, tell them you love them no matter what, and you're going to have a happy kid on your hands. But it's the ones that are not affirmed at home, that have a miserable time at school, that are bullied, that end up with self-harm, or as all too often happens, they end up taking their own life. You'll see a term down at the bottom called cisgender. A lot of these terms have Greek Latin roots, cis meaning on the same side of, trans meaning across from or on the other side of. So you have transgender and cisgender. Cis is on the same side of. So that is for people that are congruent with their sex assigned at birth, which again is the vast majority of the population are cisgender. But if you happen to hear that term, that's what they're referring to, is the vast majority of the population. So let's talk about pronouns. Before we jump in, is there any questions or discussion on gender identity or sexual orientation? So I'm more than happy to get into that if you have questions or need a clarification anywhere along the line.
I do have a question. I wanted to know if you could just speak a little bit more to how, I know you explained all of these very well, except how would you respond to how gender is considered a spectrum?
Yeah, sure. On one side is those rigid societal, because gender is a social construct. Sex is a biological definition. So sex and gender most often line up, but sometimes they don't. So the gender construct of male is, again, those stereotypes of being the provider and the disciplinarian and good at sports and all these kind of things. On the other side of that spectrum, and it's really, there's no real end point there, you have someone who is really girly. Just a girly girl, and adheres to all these different standards, and is good with makeup, and is always spotless when she goes out, and does stereotypically feminine things. In the middle is an infinite number of points where you might say, because like I'm one of those girls myself, is I tend to be really girly all the time. I'm mostly wearing dresses, skirts, that kind of thing, except when I climb on my Harley Davidson. And then I've leather up, and I've got my jeans and my helmet, my gloves, and I get out and get my face in the wind and have a blast. And you see me riding that, you can't tell male, female, or what, other than the fact that I'm, 6 feet tall and riding a Harley Davidson. It's like, okay, I might get some puzzled looks. I pull the helmet off, and there's this bunch of blonde hair, and it's like, oh, okay. So that's kind of what I mean, is there are people that live their lives and identify saying this toxic masculinity or whatever masculine extreme isn't for me. But I'm also not, way over here in the girly girl section. I'm just somebody who may like to play sports, but also, like to, I don't know. I had a discussion with the Dallas police recently over the way they had written what's called a probable cause affidavit. And so what they have to do is to outline their probable cause for arresting a suspect. And it happened to be a transgender suspect. And so they said it was a biological male dressed as a woman. And so I was asking the detectives, I said, what does dressed like a woman even mean? I mean, does it mean they're wearing like jeans and a hoodie and a pair of sneakers? Because that describes half the women in Dallas County. I mean, was the suspect wearing a prom dress? Was the suspect wearing, a pencil skirt and a pair of heels? we don't know what the suspect was wearing because it just said dressed as a woman. So we have no idea, because women can wear pretty much anything and get away with it. So you might have someone that is saying, I like to wear girls' jeans, but I'm going to wear jeans instead of a dress. And so there's all those little points along that continuum of someone that might be a little bit rougher as far as sports and aggressive as far as competition, but also maybe wearing the softer side of clothing, or liking to, gravitating towards doing things that are stereotypically feminine. So it's just, girls, playing with Legos and doing things that are involved in science or STEM. And that's one of the things that we're trying to encourage, is this sort of gender diversity in making it okay for girls to take STEM studies and encourage them to do that. I work with a organization called Girl Up, which is a foundation of the United Nations. And their whole goal is to get girls into STEM studies. And one of the things they had to do is to understand why girls would get into STEM studies, why they get into any studies. And it's because they look at things differently than guys do. Guys are saying, what is it going to say about me if I do this career as an engineer? Or how much money can I make doing that? Or how much power can I have doing that? Girls say, how can I change the world? How can I make the world a better place? And so if you can show them how being a marine biologist can help them clean and save species in the ocean and do all these sort of things that, are beneficial to the planet, they're like gung-ho and all in. It's not they can't understand STEM programs. It's just that it's kind of, does this fit with what I view myself as doing later in life? So that's kind of a roundabout way of explaining it. It's that they identify in ways that are in some ways variations from the gender norms. And it's an infinite way of expressing themselves. That makes sense?
Yes, that does. That really does help. Thank you. I have a question here in the chat box.
Yeah.
So this parent educator has a family where there are two women that are co-parenting.
Yeah.
And she has always referred to the two women as chicas or ladies, right? And she just wants to know a better way a respectful way to ask them if that is how they identify, without offending them, if it is, or she just wants to make sure she isn't offending them by calling them ladies, if maybe they don't identify that way, maybe they haven't shared that with her. And so she wants to know what's the most respectful way to ask someone how they identify.
Probably exactly what you just said just now, is to ask them to say respectfully, how best can I refer to you in a respectful way? Because I don't want to get locked into mom and dad, or, it could be parents, might be how they would prefer it. And I want to talk about that too, because there was a lawsuit down in Mansfield a while back over a teacher who, I think it was on the first or second day, it was early in the school year, but she brought a picture of her wife to show the class, because teachers will often do that, is this is who I'm married to. And so the kids aren't horrified by it. Because that was completely age appropriate for young kids. But they go home and they tell their parents, hey, Miss Watkins has a wife. The parent of this friend of mine, or our teacher, is married to a woman, or that kind of thing. And so the parents freaked out and said, what are you talking about? Lesbian relationships with our kids, and that's inappropriate, and yada, yada, yada. My personal belief is, as long as you keep things age appropriate, you can tell kids anything, and you should be able to. That's what they're going to be exposed to in life. I have a granddaughter named Hannah, who's now 10, but she was 7 at the time when Katie and I got married. And so we had sent wedding invitations. My kids live in Atlanta, and she put the wedding invitation, my daughter, up on the refrigerator. And so Hannah, who was 7, she read the wedding invitation, and she knows my daughter Sarah's maiden name is McMurray, same as mine. And so she looks at it and she said, Mom, is Grandma Leslie your mom? And she said, no, she's my dad, but now she's a girl. And Hannah said, oh, okay. So that's the end of that discussion. She's 7. That was completely age appropriate. It was honest. It was truthful. It was to the point. It gave Hannah the information that she needed, and she's fine with it. She's never questioned me about it. She's never had an issue with it. Hannah and I are just like thick as thieves when I go to Atlanta and see her. I get along great. But she just kept it age appropriate. And I thought that was just so brilliant. But the other thing, if you listen to the way the language she used, is she used feminine pronouns throughout. She said, no, she's my dad, but now she's a girl. And so Hannah is learning those, and the kids have never, ever made a mistake with pronouns. My daughters, never. My kids, never. They are fabulous at it. And that's so important to me. Although I did ask my kids, this is like 5 or 6 years ago, I guess, but I said, when you guys are talking on the phone together, because my 2 daughters live about 4 miles apart in Atlanta. And I said, when you guys are talking about me on the phone, do you call me Dad or Leslie? And my youngest, Chrissy, she said, it's about 50-50, half Dad, half Leslie. And I said, that's fine. I said, if you want it, because I'm not their mom. And so I said, if you want to call me Dad, I'm okay with that. I'm never going to take that person from you. But, I personally, I prefer Leslie. It's a lot easier. we were shopping in a Target one time, and this was early in my transition. But we were like separated by a dozen clothing racks. And so one of my daughters held up this top and she goes, hey, Dad, do you like this? And I said, can we not? So yeah, in a Target, I prefer not Dad. But pronouns are really, really important. If someone tells you their pronouns, please use them. Getting misgendered, it hurts like a slap in the face. And I'll give a couple of little examples. I don't like going through drive-throughs anymore because I know what my voice sounds like here on this. But if you don't have anything to look at, like at drive-throughs or just over the telephone, I know I sound more like your uncle than your aunt. I worked in radio for 30 years. I know what my voice sounds like. I had headphones on. And so I know it sounds, God, if I get a cold, I sound like James Earl Jones. It's terrible. And, I feel like calling up and, doing voiceovers. This is CNN. But it's terrible. So I don't like getting called sir. It can be embarrassing. It could be humiliating, and it could be dangerous because there are enough people out there that want to harm transgender people just for who we are. There was a murder trial in Dallas just this week of a guy who killed a Black transgender woman named Chanel Lindsay in 2019. He ended up getting 37 years. But there's just too many of us that get hurt. So I'm definitely on red alert if I get misgendered. But there's also an example. I was at a wedding and they had valet parking. And I didn't even say anything to this girl. She was like in her mid-20s, I guess. And I just handed her the card so she could find my car. And she said, thank you, sir. I'll be right back. And I'm wearing this pretty flower print dress. I'm wearing heels. I'm full face of makeup. And I turned to my wife, Katie, and I said, what am I giving off? And I carried that around, just that one word. I carried that around for days into the next week. It haunted me. And I'm looking in the mirror and going, what could I do differently? Do I need to, what? I was beating myself up over that. So it really does hurt because to me, there's safety in just passing as another woman, of just being part of the milieu. That's me. I don't want to walk into a room and, be the tallest person because I have heels that are really cute, but like I said, I'm 6 feet tall. If I put on a pair of heels, I'm now 6'4" or 6'5", and I feel like Gulliver. So that's not how I want to walk into a room. So I wear flats pretty much everywhere all the time, so I can be as unobtrusive as I can possibly be. So if someone tells you their pronouns, it really, really is important because they're telling you, this is who I am. And if you get those wrong, whether it's intentional or otherwise, essentially you're saying, no, you're not. Not to me, you're not. And that for us is very troubling. So let's talk about some pronoun do's and don'ts. Please do recognize that everybody has pronouns. If you've ever received an email from me, you'll see down at the bottom is my pronouns. My email signature says Leslie McMurray, Transgender Education Advocacy Associate Resource Center, she, her. If I have one of those convention badges, it has my name, Leslie McMurray, and she, her underneath. Not everyone does that. I wish they would, but not everybody does. But for those that do, I gravitate towards them because I know they're safe to go talk to, because they get it. They understand the importance of pronouns. And pronouns are not just important to trans people, they're important to everybody, because if trans people are the only ones that use them, well, that's kind of singling us out, isn't it? It's kind of like making a trans kid use the bathroom in the nurse's office. What's going on? Why do they have to use that bathroom when they don't use, and so the kids start, they notice, they know. So it can be problematic. Asking pronouns is very important, and it's also something that you're never going to offend somebody by asking for their pronouns. I wouldn't suggest asking for them several times, but if they tell you the first time, to remember them and get it. But it's not something that is going to be troublesome. If you meet somebody and you say, hi, my name is Leslie, my pronouns are she, her, and you are, that's fine. It won't offend anyone. But asking for the pronouns is important, both so that someone is not misgendered, but also so that trans people are not the only ones who feel the need to share their pronouns. Ask people pronouns that they use when they ask their name. Bear in mind, pronouns can sometimes change, okay? Some of the don'ts, don't refer to pronouns such as they or them as gender neutral pronouns, because they're not really. While some trans people may identify as gender neutral, many see themselves as gendered, just somewhere along that spectrum. So non-binary pronouns is the better language. Make sense? Don't describe pronouns as preferred. My pronouns are my pronouns. I don't prefer she and her pronouns. Those are my pronouns. It's like if you call me he, him, that's not acceptable, but she, her is preferred. So I hear sometimes people refer to pronouns as, well, what are your preferred pronouns? What are your pronouns? If you want to go with preferred name, that's okay, because trans people often might change their name. They might not have been able to change it legally yet. And because I was using Leslie for a couple of years prior to the time when I was able to change it legally. And so you can use preferred name. Also, preferred name doesn't hang transgender people out to dry, because like my dad, he was James Thomas McMurray, but no one ever called him that. They always called him Bill, because he got that nickname when he was just a little kid by his brother. And for his whole life, everyone called him Bill. So if someone were to ask, what's your legal name? He'd write James Thomas McMurray. They said, what's your preferred name? He'd write Bill. So that's totally appropriate. Preferred name on forms and all that sort of stuff is great, but pronouns are pronouns. Don't indicate that you don't care which pronouns are used. This can reinforce the privilege that many cis people have in not worrying about ever having been misgendered. Most people aren't, but we do. And part of what causes that, and it's like why I say I was so critical on myself, is the human brain back in the day, the whole tribal thing, we were able to tell someone who's different by the facial geometry, their body structure, and to make that decision like that, because it was important, because someone may be attacking your tribe or coming to take your food or whatever it might be. And so we still have those abilities left over from those days where we can look at somebody and determine male or female just by facial geometry in an instant. And there's a lot of different attributes that, you know, women have more of the triangular shape to the face. Men have more of a brow ridge and a higher hairline that kind of recedes on the sides. Women's hairline tends to be much lower on the forehead. So there's a lot of these little subtle differences, and trans people obsess over them. It drives us crazy. I mean, I would just ache to have a body that isn't, you know, broad shoulders or, you know, hands that can palm a basketball. They don't do me any favors. And so I could pick myself apart. It just, so most people don't get misgendered because all of that geometry lines up and the brain sees what the brain sees and we're all good. But for trans people, it can be a little bit of a nightmare, as that ability to pick out faces and things gets us misgendered sometimes. And again, it could be embarrassing. It could also put us in harm's way. Being outed even inadvertently can be harmful, as I was saying. Privilege is never having the wrong pronouns used. Sharing yours takes nothing from you, but can make us feel more comfortable around you. So what if you make a mistake? I was in Atlanta for Thanksgiving a few years ago, and my sister-in-law, Debbie, was hosting. So it was over at her house. And they got a big family over there. And so they'd taken the chairs from the dinner table and they brought them into the living room and put them around the TV and the fire and all that. So we were just sitting there talking. And my wife, Katie, who's also transgender, she and I were kind of closest to the kitchen. So when she was ready to serve dinner, Debbie comes out. She looks at Katie and I and she goes, "Hey, would you guys grab the chairs and put them around the tables? We're just about ready to serve dinner." And I said, "Sure, Deb, no problem." And she takes like 2 steps away and she comes back and she goes, "Oh my God, I'm so sorry. I said, you guys, and I didn't mean like you guys are guys. I just said you guys." And she's just going in this circular thing. And it's like, by now everybody's staring. And I said, "It's okay, just calm down. It's all right. We use you guys all the time. It's no big deal." And then I jokingly said, if you would have said, "Well, you two dudes grab those chairs, now we're going to go outside and fight." So she laughed, we laughed, and we put the chairs around the table. So if you make a mistake, don't make a federal case out of it, because that's not what we want. I would say if someone corrects you, make the apology last as long as the correction. Because if you say he or sir or something to me, it's like today, we're having somebody come over and do some work in the house, and they wrote, because of my voice on the phone, wrote me an email to confirm that said, "Mr. McMurray." And so I corrected him just very briefly and said, "Oh, by the way, it's Mrs. McMurray." So now he's cool. If he does it again, then we're going to have an issue. But if it's a quick correction of it's not he, it's she, great. "I'm sorry, I'll get that right. My apologies." And then move on. It shouldn't be a big thing. If it's repeated and over time and it's really frustrating, or that person is having a really rotten day and they make the correction longer, just make the apology a little bit longer. "I am really, really sorry. I didn't mean to hurt you or embarrass you. I'll make sure that I get that down. I'm going to, do what I have to do to make sure it doesn't happen again." Cool. So yeah, if you make a mistake, generally, please don't make a big, giant production out of it, because mostly trans people, we don't want that either. Additional useful terms. I talked about the term queer. When I was growing up, if my dad used it, it had some sting to it. It wasn't a kind word growing up. So I don't feel comfortable using it. It's just not something it doesn't feel right in my mouth. So I don't use it. I use LGBT community. There's lots of other ways that I can refer to the group. But a lot of people identify as queer, and they're perfectly okay. They tend to be younger. It's sort of a generational kind of term. So I would just be careful using it, because it is a word that has some history behind it. And it's also, the usage of it can be different, because you could say that there's the queer community. You might say, "Hey, there's a queer art exhibition at the museum this week. Let's go have a look at that." That is perfectly fine as well. But you wouldn't want to say, "Hey, there's a couple of queers in the lobby waiting to come in." That would be inappropriate. Or "those queers" would be inappropriate. So just be careful how you use it. Some people have absolutely no problem with it, but others do. And if it's used incorrectly, it can be offensive. And questioning is just somebody who asks questions about their sexual orientation or gender identity, whatever the case might be. And there's the big alphabet slide. That's lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer questioning. Intersex, which is someone with essentially kind of ambiguous genitalia. They're about as common as people with red hair. Although people with red hair, tend to, be visible, but intersex people tend to wear clothes, but they're out there. And then allies or asexual, and then of course pansexual. So there's all the different identities, and here they are in neat little boxes and stuff like that. So
Leslie, I'm sorry, excuse me. I'm so sorry.
Sure.
Would you be able to share this presentation with us?
Of course.
Like by email? I
Yeah,
know we're recording this, but it might also be helpful to be able to refer to the slides.
Yeah, absolutely. No problem at all. I just got a couple of more because we're right up against time, and I want to make sure if there's any questions that we're able to get to those. But some of the ones that you want to avoid are sexual preference, it's sexual orientation. Preference implies that it's like a decision or a menu, and your sexual orientation, who you're attracted to, is who you're attracted to. There's no preference to it. Lifestyle, same sort of way. It's like if you grow your own food, that's a lifestyle. But if you are gay or lesbian, not a lifestyle. Dead naming is using the birth name of a transgender person. It's like, I've been giving you my dead name. My legal name is Leslie. It's not the name I was given at birth. Even my close friends don't know it. They don't need to know it. And so using that can be hurtful, because it's like if you have someone that has transitioned from male to female and you call them Tim, again, it's kind of like using the wrong pronouns as well. So dead naming is something that is sometimes used to bully students, because a student will find out the dead name of a trans kid and use it in social media and out them that way. And so that's a kind of a form of bullying that you want to look out for, because it can be tremendously damaging. Other terms, tranny is a term of violence. It's often one that's used prior to violence being visited upon us. It happened in North Dallas. There was a trans girl on the street, a guy in a red truck pulled up, yelled tranny, and shot her 6 times. So that's not a word. It's like if I hear it, I'm either going to duck or come up swinging. So if you're able to call out inappropriate language, please do so, whatever that language may be. Know the terms, use them, and encourage others on proper use. And if you have any questions, my email is there, my phone number is in the chat, and I'm always available.
Leslie, can I ask a quick question?
Of course.
Could you go back like 4 slides?
Yes, I sure can.
Oh, up one,
On this one?
back one more.
Okay.
No, it's the list of the, keep going.
Is it the
There we
pronouns
go.
list?
There we
Oh.
go. Gender fluid and non-binary. How are they different?
Non-binary is someone who does not identify completely as someone who is male or female. And gender fluid is someone that may express gender differently from one day to the next. If someone's non-binary and they've settled at this point along the continuum, let's say, just for the sake of argument and ease of understanding, that they are like a third towards the middle from the masculine side. So they may wear, a wallet with a chain on it and some biker boots, but may have longer hair, may wear makeup, maybe signed female at birth, but they're going to be that way every day. That's just how they dress. They're going to wear the flannel shirt and the leather jacket, and that's how they're going to be. Someone who's gender fluid might wear a biker jacket one day and blue jeans and that kind of stuff, but also might wear the next day skinny jeans and more silk type blouse. So the fluidity is going to express itself from one day to the next to the next. Someone who's non-binary is just going to be non-binary, and where they settle and their identity isn't going to vacillate from one day to the next.
Got it. Thank you.
Sure. Anything else?
I wanted to share something that someone shared with us in the chat. And it says, I am so incredibly grateful for this discussion. My kiddo is in the process of coming out as non-binary, and this kind of discussion helps make the world safer for them.
I sure hope so. And just send my love to them, because you think about the courage that it takes, because when you're a little kid, you learn everything from your parents. I mean, what's hot, what's not, what food's okay to eat, what dogs are okay to pet, everything. I mean, the basics of human life. And they're the ultimate authority. And it has to take a tremendous amount of courage for that kid to say, I'm not a girl or I'm not a boy. I'm, somewhere in between. And they're right. And like in my case, my doctor wrote boy on this birth certificate, and You have no idea the baggage that's associated with that one little letter on a birth certificate. It laid a track down for my life that I was expected to do from the day that I was born to the day I die. And to veer off from that and to do things that society doesn't expect or want you to do, and that other people in your life don't want you to do, is utterly terrifying. And it takes a tremendous amount of courage for these kids to come out and say these words to their parents. And for the ones that react in a way that's unconditional love, I have more respect and love for you than I could ever tell, because too many parents, I'll give you one statistic before I run, but they did a homeless census in Dallas not that long ago. And they found that while LGBTQ kids made up about 7% of the population, they made up 40% of the homeless kids. They are grossly overrepresented. And that's because when they come out, their parents show them the door. And those are the kids that don't make it. And so the single best thing that you can do for your kids is to love them for who they are. You don't have to encourage it. You don't have to discourage it. Love them for who they are. So thank you for having this training, because it's so, so, so important. And I really, really appreciate it. Like I said, there's others that we have as well. If there's something that I can come back and help along the way with, just let me know, because I'm here.
Yeah. Thank you so much for joining us and for sharing your knowledge, your experience, your story with us, more than anything. I did have one more anonymous question, but it is already 2:03 and we need to wrap up. So I don't know if you can answer this in 2 minutes, but we have to end in 2 minutes.
I'll do my best.
All right. So him, their, them pronouns. What is the respectful way to address someone with those particular pronouns?
Him, they, them. What they're telling you is that those are interchangeable. Because it's very common for kids to identify in a non-binary way, but to say, I'm still okay with my birth sex or my birth gender. I'm still okay with that, but I'm also accepting they, them. And what they're really telling you is they want you to use them interchangeably. So if you were with somebody for a couple of hours and you were just to intersperse them as you're going along, that is the best of all possible. So. And
That
we're
was
waiting
great.
for 2 minutes.
Yeah, that was great. Less than 2 minutes. Well, thank you so much, Leslie. We're definitely going to keep in touch with you. We've recorded this session, so there may be questions in the future. Thank you for dropping your number in the chat. I'm going to go ahead and keep it as well.